reminding for all the earlier very lovely interactions with BCIC, and I'm happy to see Raju, who was sort of really instrumental in also many of those engagements, participating in this meeting. Yeah. What I thought I'll do is, while I think the focus is really on the technology industry, my first observation or perspective which I wanted to share is that the fact is, if you have looked at economic cycles over the last 30, 40 years, I think it's a reality that there will be the booms and the busts. And that is pretty much, even if you look at events which have happened over the last maybe 30 years. We had a global recession in 86, 88. And the moment such an economic bust happened, it starts reflecting in what is a single parameter by which we'll measure economic strength and capability, which is really our public stock markets. But the interesting aspect in terms of these economic booms and busts, prior to this happening, the stock market always sort of is very positive. So just to give an example, in the 86-88 global recession, the 3-year return before the fall started was 45%. And during the recession, from the peak, the stock markets fell by almost 40% or so. But the interesting aspect is, just after the recession ended, the 3-year return of the stock market went up to 200%. And that's true of any other period where there is a boom and a bust. You always see that before the disaster or the crisis hits, the stock market goes up. Again, if I were to take another example, if you take the dot-com bubble of 2000, prior to the period of the dot-com bust, the stock markets grew by almost 40%. And during the period of dot-com bust, the stock markets fell by 40%. But the 3-year period after the dot-com bust, the stock markets grew by almost 70%. So the first observation which I just wanted to leave with you is, economic booms and busts is a reality, but you will go through those cycles. Today we are facing it with COVID, but in the last 30 years, there have at least been 7 or 8 such instances where there has been a boom and a bust as far as markets are concerned. So this is something which we have to face in the context of a business itself, because I'm sure BCIC having a fairly diverse customer base, you have many people outside the technology industry. So I think it's a reality in every industry that there will be a boom and a bust. Having said that, I just wanted to zoom in on what I think are 2 very key fundamental elements of the technology industry itself. And I'll use 2 examples of what the technology industry has gone through in the last 20 years, just to extract some learnings out of that. One is really the e-commerce bust that happened sometime in 2000, 2001. And that came on the back of when the industry was going through a fairly very robust growth. Because as many of you recollect, there was this problem of Y2K, as we call it, where mainframe programs were written just with 2 digits. And the year 2000 was digitized, or the data was entered as 00. So with that, many of the applications would have really stopped, because you cannot process with a value 00. So a lot of the mainframe programs had to be rewritten to expand the year field. And that provided a big fillip for the Indian IT industry, and the industry in the period when the Y2K services were there grew by almost 70%. And that's how a lot of the early companies also reached $1 billion as revenue. Be it Wipro or Infosys or Cognizant, all of them reached $1 billion revenue with the tailwind of the Y2K services. And then the e-commerce boom started. I think companies started seeing internet businesses, and there's a lot of service companies which started getting built around just providing internet services. And Mindtree, having started in 1999, was again one such company which really wanted to leverage the broader acceptance of internet. So we really went into the market providing only internet based application services to customers. But suddenly in late 2000, early 2001, all of this went bust. Practically 75% of the startups which started providing internet-based services, they all closed down. And essentially customers who had a fear that startups might eat their business and were investing in internet-based solutions also stopped investing in that. So the industry overnight faced a scenario where demand went down from a high peak to a zero, and it really hit, in a way, startups like Mindtree. We started off very well in 99 August, did revenues at that time of 9 million, which in rupee terms would have translated to about 50 crores or so, which itself was a very good number in the first year of operation. And then suddenly, as we're into the second year, from 50 crores, it went down to almost zero. And that was a very significant impact for the industry. But what we saw after that was, while the bust happened and demand became very constrained during that time period, after a 12-month period, the demand started picking up rapidly. In fact, if I were to go back again to the Mindtree example, from 50 crores, we almost went down to zero. Then we had to do a lot of cost cutting, try and survive the whole crisis. And we had to expand our range of services from being just internet services. We had to expand our range of services. But the period between 2002 to 2006 was probably the best years of growth for the company. We got back to year-on-year growth of 80%. During the 4-year period, our CAGR growth was about 65%. Mindtree became the fastest company to reach $100 million revenue in 6 years. And we listed the company then in 2007 in National Stock Exchange and the Bombay Stock Exchange. But the key lesson which we learned out of this boom and bust of the technology demand itself is that the nature of technology demand is like what I call a spring effect. So I think many of us who know the spring, you can compress it, but the moment you release the spring, the energy comes out with potentially a larger force. So the nature of technology demand is also like that. In the short term, companies cut down spends and compress demand. But the moment the business comes back to normal, the demand really ricochets with a higher force, which is what happened in the time 2002 to 2006, when overall the industry got the benefit of what I call a pent-up demand of technology, which helped companies like Mindtree grow and get scale. It also helped the larger companies, the TCS, the Infosys, the Wipros, and the Cognizant, to become multi-billion-dollar corporations, because the industry itself grew by almost 40% CAGR during that time period. So the first aspect on the technology industry, I would like to leave with you what I have learned from the past, is that demand, when compressed for technology, is not a demand which is lost, but it certainly comes back, which is not true of many consumer industries. Like today, if airlines suffers a loss of demand, it's not that people are going to catch up on that, which is not true of the hotel business also. So that way, fundamentally, the technology business is little different. But what really helped companies, again, I'm now coming back to the lessons for companies, is that in the period when there's a bust and then the industry started growing, because the industry also reinvented itself and started offering what I call as adjacent services. While the period before 2000 was just mainframe maintenance support, doing year 2000 jobs, beyond 2000, the industry started offering implementation services for ERP, which is an adjacent service, but provided an entirely new revenue model for the industry. They started offering remote infrastructure management. They started offering independent testing as a service. So the big lesson for the industry is also that while the demand for technology services rebounds, companies need to also rethink themselves and start expanding their range of services to offer adjacent services. So that's really the lessons learned and the impact of the e-com bust on the technology industry in the years 2000 to 2001-2. Now, if we move little forward and come to the year 2009, we had what is called the global financial crisis. The Lehman Brothers failure based on the subprime loan crisis was the trigger to it. But clearly, it started impacting every segment to the extent that pretty much well-known companies like an AIG or Goldman Sachs ran out of capital and had to be helped. In some cases, government sort of bailed them out by having very strong stimulus packages. Obviously, such a major macro change also hit the technology industry. Like I mentioned, the technology industry was growing at 25-30% prior to that. But suddenly it came down to sub 10%. In fact, if I recollect right, in 2009, the growth was just 3-4% at an industry level, which in the 15-year history of the industry, it was the lowest growth. And obviously, that also impacted companies. But when I go back to the original idea which I shared with you on technology demand, while demand was compressed in the year 2009 and part of 10 also, but the moment businesses started getting back to normal, the demand really ricocheted very strongly. So the years between 2010 to 2014-15 really were again very good growth years for the company. Though the industry had reached a critical mass of, I think at that time it was about 80-85 billion at an industry level in terms of growth, the size had become larger. Still, the industry was growing at 20% plus in the period 2011 to 15, which in a way substantiate my theory that technology demand, even if you compress it in the short term, it ricochets back with force. So that's what really happened. But the important lessons again from this crisis which happened due to the global financial crisis is that all technology companies had broad-based their services. They were serving all the services which are required by an enterprise. But in this change of the global financial crisis, few companies saw digitization was something which companies will need in the future. And they started investing in it early. Like I recollect in Mindtree, we started a digital business group in 2011 when nobody even talked about digitization. We had started doing some of the early work on cloud, and now it's called the Microsoft Azure. So we were probably the first ones to do work on Azure and gain deep knowledge into how a cloud infrastructure really functions. And that certainly helped us grow faster than the industry and take a leadership position in a new area of services, which is cloud digitization. Now, so the sort of lesson which I wanted to sort of leave with you was in the transition after GFC, there were a few companies which did not see newer services coming in, and they were late to start, and they really lost out. And without naming companies, if you take the top 4 or 5, except the top one, TCS, I think amongst the top 5, almost everybody went through a period of crisis on growth, and some of them, even today, after 6, 7 years, continue to have the crisis. Though they started off late in realizing that the next stage of growth will come by investing into new areas like digitization, cloud, etc. So the important 2 lessons based on the GFC, which I'd like to leave with you, is that, like I said, booms and busts are a reality, and they impact every industry differently. But within the technology industry, the positive aspect is that the demand ricochets. So while in one boom and bust cycle of the e-commerce, companies enlarged their scope of services and consequently grew stronger. In the second crisis, which is the GFC, some companies did not see the future services and consequently did not gain as much as some of the companies which saw the future cycle little ahead of the others. So having sort of, in a way, distilled some of these learnings, I would now come to the current crisis, which, like the GFC, this is also impacting a wide spectrum of industries. It's not that it's impacting just the banking and financial services, it's impacting a lot of industries. But the big difference, even today, I don't think any of us have clarity on when potentially this crisis itself will end. So to that extent, based in terms of current data points, my belief is that the scale and impact of the current crisis is much, much larger than even the global financial crisis. And consequently, it is going to impact the technology companies. Having said that, there is going to be a big difference between some segments which have really been quote unquote distressed in the context of this crisis. I would like to call out segments like airlines. I think they've just moved from normal revenue to zero revenues within a very short span of probably a week or so. And airlines traditionally has been a very high capex industry with high fixed costs. And even at utilizations of 85-90%, airlines are struggling to make money because the other big volatility in their revenue streams was the price of oil, which has always fluctuated. But with this crisis, I think the airlines industry is completely, I would almost say, decimated. And I think they're not going to recover quickly. So I think even in the context of leveraging technology, there is going to be a very significant downside in the airline industry. Similarly, is the hospitality industry, particularly models of companies which have assets which they own or assets which they have franchised out. The Marriotts and the Hiltons and global brands like that. I think they're also going to get hit very hard. So the difference within the technology industry is that while like GFC, this crisis is impacting people. in a far more broader sense, there is going to be some segments which are going to lose out much more than other segments. In fact, I think there could be some segments which will actually gain by this crisis because people are going to leverage services from those companies, irrespective of what the impact of the crisis is. For example, banking and financial services. I'm sure all of us who are in this meeting, we have not stopped using our banking services because of this lockdown and the consequent actions of that. Similarly, I'm sure the securities market is functioning as near as normal. So clearly the fintech companies and companies in the BFSI will start investing more in digitization, start offering services to customers on a 24/7 basis. So there is going to be an upside for technology companies on that. Healthcare is the other segment where there is going to be very significant upsides based on this crisis. So the big lesson for me out of the COVID crisis is that, one, in my perspective, this is going to create a much larger impact and a bigger impact than global financial crisis. The impact is not going to be uniform across segments. There are going to be several segments which are going to get impacted. There are some which are going to have a positive impact out of this crisis. Having said that, let me just talk about what the short-term and the medium-long-term impact or the scenario for technology companies. In the short term, particularly for IT services, there is going to be challenges on demand because most customers aren't clear how their own markets are going to pan out. So they are going to be cautious in terms of existing services. And customers are going to demand cost advantages, price reductions on existing services, which is going to be negative for the demand scenario of IT services companies. On the other hand, customers have seen the benefit of how technology can keep their businesses going, even in a crisis like this. So they're not going to cut down on discretionary spends, particularly on digital initiatives where they're reaching out to customers, where they're enhancing their supply chain. Customers are not going to cut down spends, and those spends are going to be fairly robust, but they'll be prioritized. So in the short term, in a 12-month time period, I would think the IT industry, from what last year, they would have probably grown in the high single digit, 8 to 9%, will probably come down to either a zero or marginally negative growth, maybe even a negative growth of -1 to 2%. But fundamentally, I think there is one big change which has happened between the GFC, which happened about 10 years back to now. Until then, technology was merely an enabler. So I still recollect just after the global financial crisis, many of my customers said, I'm going to cut budgets next year by 30-40%. So there was panic within many of the customer organizations. But today, when I'm speaking to customers, they are not panicking. In fact, most customers are pleasantly surprised the way in which technology has helped them run their business much more smoothly. See, in a way, if you even take this meeting, earlier we couldn't have thought of a meeting like this without a technology like GoToMeeting or each one of us having collaborative tools to even have an interaction like this. So in a way, technology is becoming core to most enterprises from being an enabler. So to that extent, customers are not panicking and cutting technology spends, but are seeing where are other sources where they can get optimization of costs. Obviously, in technology, like I mentioned earlier, where IT service providers are supporting existing applications, they will demand cost reductions and so on. But overall, I don't see a panic reaction of cutting down technology spends. And now, if I were to apply the other idea which I shared with you both on the e-commerce bust as well as the GFC, that the nature of technology demand has a spring effect and the pent-up demand will come once businesses get to normal. I anticipate beyond the 12-month period, technology spend will probably go back to normal or start increasing. Yeah. And that is really going to play well for technology companies because just like probably for all of us, a smartphone has become a necessary sort of tool. Uh, Enterprises will start thinking in terms of collaboration tools, of proper devices by which people can do their work wherever they are. Uh, Enterprises will start thinking in terms of investing in technology solutions by which they seamlessly reach out to their consumers. So digitization will start getting a far more bigger thrust. The other key element why the Indian IT services has a much more positive outlook beyond a 12-month period is that I was speaking to a few customers, primarily overseas customers, and many of them were pleasantly surprised that in spite of the crisis, and 90% of the people had to move to a work from home model, still none of their services suffered. In fact, they said, yes, business volume had come down marginally, but all our technology systems function in a very predictable manner without a downtime. So the overall confidence of customers in offshoring and services being delivered being of a high quality has increased. So I anticipate customers will start pushing more work offshore because they also need the cost advantages associated with offshore. And the other good part which has happened is business users who earlier weren't convinced of a work happening, say, 8,000, 10,000 miles away, in this crisis have seen that that works. So they are also far more open to the idea of offshoring work. Yeah. And that's important because 10 years back, when technology was just an enabler, the technology industry was only addressing the budget of a typical CIO, which in segments used to be a percentage of revenue. Like retail used to spend 3% of their revenue on technology. So you're only addressing a narrow percentage of the revenue of an enterprise spend. But today, a chief marketing officer is probably leveraging far more digital marketing than traditional approach to marketing. Yeah. And that again is a technology spend. The chief supply chain officers looking at digitizing his supply chain, which again is a technology spend. So the pie which the technology industry addresses is no more the 2 to 3% which they used to address earlier. It's probably in the 10 to 20%. So the pie itself has enlarged significantly. So I would think in the medium term, the demand for technology companies in terms of services from global enterprises would certainly get to become very strong, largely because technology is becoming very core to any enterprise. And enterprises are realizing that they don't have a choice. They have to deploy technology to get better connect to their customers and be relevant in their markets. And offshoring will also become much more mainstream. Having said that, I'll cover the last part of my observations on how do IT services companies need to, in a way, rethink themselves and try and survive. The first thing is, as this challenge sort of uh, pans out to the next stage, technology companies should try and retain their existing customers. Because by and large, technology business is a very customer-driven business. Across technology companies, be it a product company or a services company, typically 70 to 80% of business comes from existing customers. So protecting existing customers becomes extremely important in the context of trying to remain relevant in their business. And since customers will start demanding far more tighter commercial terms, they will start demanding cost reductions. If as an incumbent vendor, any technology provider is not able to retain their customers, I think they will end up being losers in the next phase of the industry. The second key element is, like I said, offshoring is also going to become mainstream. The whole idea of working from home would also start getting to become more a reality. Already the number one company in the industry, TCS, which has close to 100 billion market cap, has said that in 5 years they anticipate 75% of their workforce to work from home. And TCS has a workforce of close to about 430,000 people. So the leader in the industry has taken that stance, and it's important that all others also start putting together both the tools and the infrastructure to make it happen, because it's not just a question of transporting a laptop or a desktop onto the employee's home. It involves a whole set of infrastructure, collaboration tools to really make it happen. And also the ability for the project managers to manage a distributed workforce. I think till now, IT services companies have by and large had not a remote sort of working, but people working maybe in different offices. But project teams have been pretty much have been physically together. And some of the new methods of engineering, and some of you might have heard of it, are approaches like what you call agile engineering approach, which replace the traditional waterfall method of building IT solutions, required a daily stand-up meeting and so on. But project managers today aren't really geared up nor been trained to manage remote workforce. So there will be a significant retraining on some of the project management approaches, which also becomes very critical. The third aspect is, I think the technology industry will start having more of the gig economy workers, something like the Uber Ola model, where specialists will say, you know what, I don't want to work with one company. I'm a specialist. I do great work on user interface. So I'll work with Infosys for the first 3 months. Then I'll take a break for 1 month. Then the next 3 months, I'll work with Wipro. So I think at least 10 to 15% of the technology workforce will become what I call mobile workers. And managing the mobile workers, how do you really ensure that they feel attracted to you and come back to work for you when you have a critical work, is again another aspect which IT services companies need to really, I would say, make it happen. Because till now, you have really thought of attracting employees and keeping them happy. In spite of all the efforts, the industry runs at a 20% attrition. If you take the business process management industry, it runs probably at a 35% attrition. And at 35% attrition, every 2 years, your team almost changes. So that's the level of churn. Now, and in a knowledge industry, you cannot afford this churn. Now, so beyond employees, how do you make yourself an attractive option to the future gig workers of the technology industry is what I think technology companies will need to prepare themselves for. So while I do see that there's a short-term challenge, personally, I think there's a huge opportunity in the technology industry, partly because globally there are no industries which both in economic booms and busts have grown. Because the technology industry, if you take the last 30 years, even during bust cycles, it has probably remained flat, uh, but never degrown rapidly. Whereas today, if you take an industry like automobile or metals, they're volatile industries, even at a global level. And the demand can fluctuate from possibly a growth of 3-4% to maybe a negative 20-30%. So that way, the technology industry is a very attractive industry to be in. For India, I think it's very important because already about 11% of the country's GDP comes from the technology industry. And more than anything else, it creates jobs. While I think the direct jobs is about 3.5 million jobs, it is also for every direct job creates 3 indirect jobs, which means almost 10 million people of blue collar workers work for the technology industry. So that number may change now. If the offices and campuses start getting smaller in size, the ratio of 1:3 direct indirect may change probably to 1:1.5 or not. But still, it is an industry which is creating jobs. And to that extent, I think it's important in the context of coming back to a normal economic growth. The technology industry needs to get into a better growth path so that it will really start impacting the Indian economy far more positively. But I think attractiveness of the industry is still very strong. It is global in nature. It has potential to demonstrate growth maybe for the next 5 to 10 years. And as long as companies can understand how they need to operate in the changed environment and put in necessary change management within the organizations to change, I think you will certainly see new winners coming out of this challenge. So that's really a sort of breadth of perspectives I just wanted to share, both on the lessons learned from the technology industry based on the past crisis. How does that reflect on the current crisis? And what I think is the medium long-term future of the industry, and how do companies need to be prepared for it? With this, I'll
Thanks,
probably
NKK.
turn it over to the audience for questions.
Thanks, NKK. There are a lot of questions have come in the chat box. So let me just ask the questions to you, KK. The
Yeah.
first one is, the impact of COVID-19 crisis is far different from any economic boom and bust cycles. Do you think this uncertainty will have far-reaching negative impact and may take 4 or 5 years to swing back to normal? Your insights, please.
See,
Repeat
there
the
are two
question in
parts
KK
to it.
again. Shall I repeat the question
I
again?
know I got it. Whether the impact of COVID will take 4-5 years to get to normal.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. See, I'd like to answer it at two levels. One, I think for the broader economy, yeah, like I mentioned, the impact of COVID, I think, is far higher and of a bigger magnitude than even the global financial crisis. So it is going to take a much, much longer time for industries to come back to normal. See, I was very closely associated with the travel and hospitality because that was the key segment for Mindtree. So personally, I've worked with some of the largest airlines in the world and some of the biggest hospitality companies. And my conversation with them sometimes is just shocking because many of them, first of all, right now don't have a feel when they'll come back to normal.
Mm.
Even an industry association like IATA hasn't given an outlook because
Mm.
last year, I think the number of people who traveled across borders was 4.5 billion. Out of the 7 billion people in the world, more than half traveled. This year, they don't have a view. So I think for many industries to come back to normal, it may take 3-4 years. But if I have to switch to the view of the technology industry, I think it will certainly come back to normal in 12 to 18 months.
Oh, that's great to hear. Okay, the next question is very close to your heart, KK. Very, very close to your heart, knowing you. As per one recent survey, 70% of startups, mostly technology startups, are in deep crisis, and they have funds to survive only for 3 to 6 months only. The MSMEs and agri-tech sectors are badly hit. Is there any future for startups and for these sectors?
See, I'm going to give a very honest opinion on this because, like Shekhar said, I do engage with a lot of startups. Some I've invested, some I just mentor them. So to that extent, I must be honest, the last 4 weeks has been really heart-wrenching. I'm now dealing with 3 startups which have all got a good business, good team. They had finalized their funding agreement. The term sheet had been cleared. It was just that the legal agreements had to be put in place. In 2 of the cases, the investors have pulled out. And in the 3rd case, the investor said, hey, I can't give you a response just now. So the fact is those 2 aren't going to survive this crisis. Because they did not plan for having a runway ahead, and since everything had got sort of signed up, they're very hitting. So I think this crisis is going to see that there will be, I think, almost quote unquote deaths which will happen in the startup ecosystem. Having said that, to be honest, I'll give you another statistic. The fact is, while so much is talked about the startup ecosystem, the great valuation of Flipkart and so on, the fact is last year, in terms of the number of startups which started to the number which survived, only 4% of the startups which started survived beyond a certain point in time, which means they survived for 2 years, 3 years, got an institutional funding, and went to the next stage. That percentage is the lowest. While India is the 3rd best startup ecosystem, 4% success in startup is amongst the lowest. Developed countries have a success rate of 8 to 10%. So we do have 2 problems: a lower success rate of startup and this crisis hitting startups. But I wouldn't sort of, in a way, say that's negative for the startup ecosystem, because there are still some great businesses being built, some smart entrepreneurs who are, in a way, disrupting existing players. So it's important that they survive, come out of the crisis stronger. If I just flip to the MSMEs, to be honest, again, I'm absolutely pained. Everybody only talks about MSMEs and how to help them, but nobody is acting. Every MSME whom I met is just going through unmitigated pain. And I'm not seeing any concrete action which is being done to really sort of try and support.
Okay. Thanks, NKK. The 3rd question is very, very good question. The impact is threefold: with demand side uncertainty, supply side uncertainty, resource uncertainty. How will technology address this to recover fast?
See, it's interesting you're saying that. See, on the demand side, I think technology will still be an enabler to try and create demand back. Because on the other hand, I was hearing somebody say that even in red zones, supply of essential goods have really started picking up because of e-commerce. So in a way, it is trying to get demand through leveraging technology. See, the other way is I really think from the traditional mediums of TV and print advertising, there's going to be far more digital marketing, where you're going to really analyze customer data and approach a very sharply defined set of consumers and make digital marketing more effective. So there is certainly applications of technology on the demand side. Supply is going to become the biggest opportunity. In fact, many of the manufacturing companies who I've talked to, particularly those dependent on China, are now saying, how do I create a digital supply chain where if there is a dislocation happening, I get automatically rerouted to an alternate source and my supply chain doesn't really suffer. So I think automating the supply chain is going to be a big sort of impact and people will start doing it. I must be honest, on the resource side, technology can hardly do anything, except technology can be something like a data aggregator to see where is it that resources are required. In fact, there is just another COVID-related application which has been built by one of the companies, which through NASCOM Foundation, we are trying to sort of get it adopted. It is simply an aggregator to understand what are the key resources people require and how do you logistically ensure that the right people get access to the right resources.
The next question is connected to the work from home. There are two questions on the work from home in KK. One is, due to the work from home, how data security and employee productivity will get measured up, number one. And the next one is corollary to the due to work from home, do you foresee a fall in the real estate side? Real estate sector will have a challenges. Do you foresee a fall in the real estate rents and office rents? The two questions to the work.
See, on the first question, to be honest, right now, I think enterprise customers have agreed to work from home without getting bothered too much about the data security. But clearly, a lot more need to be done to protect data. I think in the crisis mode, people have agreed. So it's only for a short period of time. I'm sure as we get back to near normalcy, customers will demand that you have necessary infrastructure. Technology today can provide that. In a sense, technology can provide a highly secure tunnel from the house of the employee to the network of the company. But that costs. So somebody has to meet that cost. So while technology is available, I think we'll settle somewhere into a middle ground where some investments will be made, but for highly secure needs, work will move back to the offices. That's how I really see it. Your question on productivity is very interesting because I'll tell you it's a very, very distinct sort of thing. In the first few weeks when the lockdown happened, actually productivity improved. Because people sort of got almost, particularly in a city like Bangalore, people got back 2-3 hours of time which they used to spend on commuting. They were not mentally and physically fatigued. In fact, at least a few startup engineering teams with whom I met, they said productivity went up. But I guess what happens after 2-3 weeks is because most of our homes don't have clearly a secluded, isolated space, it does start impinging on work. So the last week when I asked somebody, he said, you know what, now it's come back to what it was normal. So I would think at best it will be retained at a normal level. And the next question is, honestly, I don't know much about real estate, but it's a gut feel that there will certainly be a little bit of softness and demand on commercial real estates.
Next question is, again, it's very close to your heart, knowing you. Last year, China was under tremendous pressure and agreed to reset the trade deficit with US. With COVID, this does not seem unlikely. Do you see US taking cohesive action and India benefiting from it on the services and the hardware front? That's a question. Another one related to that, with China's declining productivity plus rising wages and aging population, do you see India stepping into center stage to take up this slack over the next 2-3 years on the service and the hardware?
Sorry, the last point I didn't hear.
With China's declining productivity plus rising wages plus aging population, do you see India stepping into center stage to take up the slack over the next 2 to 3 years on the services and hardware?
See, I have two sort of views on this. One, I think it's a reality that the tension on the trade deficit between US and China will continue. And I think it will only get accelerated with all these challenges. What I do see is many global companies which had entirely made their supply chain dependent on China, they're really seeing that as a risk and consequently trying to de-risk themselves. So there could be certainly opportunities in terms of some of that, particularly in manufacturing, to move to India. But have we moved quickly on that? My sense is no, and there are competition. Like Vietnam is a competition, Cambodia is coming up as competition. So it is something which there is a possibility of that occurring. Yeah. But coming back to the other question, while there is certainly raising wages and an aging population in China, the opportunities that it will increase services and a piece of the hardware pie for India, I think that is little far-fetched because, see, in hardware, essentially, we don't have an ecosystem. To be honest, what we have created as manufacturing for smartphone is more an assembling sort of thing. We don't, every core component of it is imported, so we're doing large-scale manufacturing, which itself is good. But I think in hardware to win, you need to control the core elements. We don't have a single foundry. We don't have a chip making facility. So I think it's unlikely that we'll move to center stage in the hardware. On the services, to be honest, I'll tell you the age of the next range of services is going to be driven by the new form of technologies which are coming. There would be services opportunities in 5G. There would be services opportunities in AI. Interestingly, I think China is certainly well ahead of India on both these areas. So I think maybe in the next 5 years, there's very little chance that we'll displace them. But can we take away a pie of that and not allow them to control both the 5G and how AI gets implemented in enterprises? I think we need to do that.
Okay. NK, guys, there was an interesting thought which going from your response. Due to this COVID, which as you also we have started working from as a new culture, and then the way working is also coming up completely different. Will there be a more B2B business models and which will enhance the technology sector? Though I could see a lot more B2C can come in. Do you see there'll be a lot more B2B business coming up in KK?
See, there is certainly a lot more. Even in the recent past, while the first wave of the startup and the excitement was more on the B2C, increasingly in the last 12 months, it's been more B2B businesses which have started coming, and they may take very different forms. See, essentially, I'll just give out an example of a company where the ex-founders were from Flipkart. They are really in an aggregation business. On one hand, they do a business of committing volumes to large manufacturers. And then they service the smaller grocery and kirana shops so that they're really aggregating demand. So in a way, they're breaking the bulk and aggregating volume to do that. So there'll be very interesting newer forms of B2B, which will certainly become technology enabled and will start growing.
Okay. Okay, I'll not take, we'll just have 5 more minutes. So participants, if you have any questions directly, you can ask NKK. Probably we can have 2 questions. Anybody can participate. Since nobody has asked the questions, probably I'll take only one more question to you, NKK.
Sure.
Considering the fact that definitely this sort of crisis gives more opportunity for people to think differently. and more so in technology. Said India is, as you know, India is a backbone of technology. How do you think, where do you think the innovation will go, and how do you think innovation will play a greater part? And do you think the company should move from a service mind to the innovation mind, which will create much more opportunities? While I understand travel and leisure industry may take some more time to recover, but do you think innovation will play a greater part in KK?
I think innovation will probably become almost critical to even for people to survive in business. Because if
Okay.
you're just going to do the same thing and keep doing it, I don't think you're going to survive in business. Having said
Mm.
that, see, this $167 billion services-driven play, is it something which
Mm.
is going to go off? I think it's not. It is still a
Mm.
very attractive business because I think that
Mm.
demand will at least be there at that level or marginally growing. It
Mm.
is really a business which generates steady cash flows. Look at the balance sheet of the top 5 IT services organization. Together, they have
Mm.
$20 billion of cash on their balance
Mm.
sheet, which is not small. Now,
Yeah.
but at the same time, for innovating entirely new things, I think people need to rethink of very different options. So
Mm.
I think companies will start thinking in terms of putting back. See, till the business was sort of growing, I think the pressure to innovate very differently was not there. But I'm
Mm.
sure you'll find companies thinking in terms of really trying to disrupt some of their business models, but probably trying to create a newer organization to do that
Mm.
disruption. And what has
Okay.
sort of played out, Shekhar, in the last 30 years is that, again,
Mm.
look at all are very well run companies, but except
Mm.
what came up as a product which was the pinnacle of Infosys or probably TCS did one or two products, even they have not scaled because the
Mm.
rhythms
Mm.
are very different. The services
Yeah.
and the innovation driven
Sure.
ecosystem is very different. So I think a different form of organization will come.
Mm.
And I think technology companies will become more open to invest in those and try and create those.
Okay. Thank you, KK. If you have one question, probably we can ask NK. Otherwise, I would like to relieve him because he's been doing for last 1 hour continuously is talking. So if anybody
May
has
I
got
ask a
one,
Shekhar
yeah,
Manohar here? Can I ask a question,
yeah,
please?
yeah, please. This is the last question,
Okay,
please.
okay,
Yeah.
okay. Sir, I just wanted to link it up. It's tomorrow is going to depend entirely on how do we build a pipeline for the skills in what is coming up as totally new onto many sectors as a shock. So I would like to link it to education sector and the capacity building. What kind of a blueprint we can visualize to connect with the emerging industry needs, because many industries may not even know what their needs going to be in the coming months and years. At the same time, backend at the universities and the education institutions also is even more difficult to visualize and create that skill sets and the pipeline. But yet there has got to be solutions, and stakeholders have to work together. What would be your suggestion at the strategic level where we should begin? Because in many things we are still lagging behind, even in the before COVID situation. But now with COVID, after COVID, our challenges are going to be much more. How do you see the future collaboration between industry and academia? What kind of preparation has to be done on the education front, sir?
Manoj, that's a very interesting question. Now, see again, probably what I'd like to tell you is that there has been a lot of efforts on that. Just to give you a sense, see, it's a well-researched thing that artificial intelligence is going to create a $30 trillion impact on the economy in the next 5 years. And like I shared earlier, China has certainly got ahead of that. But there has been a lot of effort from the Indian government. At Niti Aayog, there's been a very, very competent team which worked on the AI blueprint for India. I was fortunate enough to be a part of the committee exactly in the skilling part of it. So there is a blueprint in terms of how do you create future skills and how does that impact various segments. So in line with that, NASSCOM, which is the industry association, has built an online platform called Future Skills Platform, which really prepares people. Because what I think all of us need to sort of accept in mind is the way in which we learn is going to be very different in the future. Gone are the days when we have a tutor to teach us. But today, with technology-enabled teaching, virtually you can deliver that content and the capacity building anywhere at scale. So that Future Skills platform is available as we talk even today. Last when I heard, I think about 200,000 people were being trained on that. For those of you who are interested, I think the website is, or if you go to NASSCOM website, nascom.org, you'll find a link to the Future Skills platform. The core foundational course for AI is actually made free till 31st of May. So
Okay.
what happens in the next stage is, I think individuals have to put effort to enhance themselves. It can't be an organizational based effort. And platforms like Future Skills will enable you to do that.
Thank you,
I agree
NKK.
with you
Thank you,
because
sir.
not
Thank you.
much of which has been publicized. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, NKK. Thanks so much for your time. I'm sure all of us have enjoyed your conversation. I enjoyed it much more. And knowing you, you have always give multiple insights on the technology side. With your expertise, we always cherish that. And really thank you for being part of BCIC. And whenever I invite you on behalf of BCIC, you have never said no to me and BCIC. Thank you so much, NKK, for sharing your time. And thanks a lot. And I thank you participants for participating today. And anybody has got any further questions or some of the questions which I missed out, please feel free to send it out. I'll share with NKK and NKK will respond. Thank you so
Shekhar,
much,
just
NKK.
on
Thank you
behalf
all.
of the chamber,
Anyways, I didn't hear you. I never thought you. I'm sorry about that.
no, my apologies for joining late. I was involved with the meeting with the
Yeah,
conversation.
I could know that. Yeah.
I just wanted to express my thanks to KK Natarajan for taking the time, educating us, sharing his thoughts. Very kind of you for taking this time out on a Saturday, sir.
Thank you so much. And Shekhar, thank you so much. And I would like to thank all the participants. Really enjoyed the conversation. And Rupa, thanks so much for organizing this. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you very
NKK.
much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you so much. Thanks all, everybody. Bye. Have a great day. Bye.
Thank you.